Welcome to Civil Discourse, a podcast where participants are free to share their ideas, empathize with other perspectives, and who intend to advance to a better solution to fix a societal ill. We will focus on topics that are particularly complicated. In a time where information is from sources more opinionated than ever, our mission is to find solutions and goals to accelerate the nation's progress with cultural impunity. I'm your host, Todd Furniss. Welcome to today's episode of Civil Discourse, hosted by Todd Furniss. I'm Todd Furniss, your host for the discussion. And before we get started, as always, I encourage you to like, share, and subscribe if you do like or care to share or care to subscribe. I really encourage the support and I welcome it. We've had a flurry of new subscribers. I'm really grateful for everybody's support. I think these conversations are important, which is why we do them. But at the same time, they're only important if people want to listen and find good value out of them. I am joined today by Deborah McMurray, and I had a conversation with Deborah, I guess, a couple of weeks ago now, and I was just so moved by the story. I've known Deborah for, a long time. I won't say how many years because that would date both of us, but the story that she shared with me was outside of the conversations we've had in the past, and to me, it was deeply moving. So I want to kind of dive into that because it is very, very important at any time, but I think it gains a little steam even especially in today's time with the pandemic and a whole range of mental health issues. Not to show the card early, but Deborah, I want to start off, your background, you're a very, very accomplished person. And I want to start off by saying, first of all, I applaud that. You have an undergraduate degree, a graduate degree, you have worked in a variety of businesses, you have your own business, you have been, by any unit of measure, a very successful person. Let's talk about your business background first, and then I want to dive into this really interesting talk you recently filmed.
Thank you, Todd. I'm delighted to be here. My business background was a very circuitous route because, as you know, my two degrees that you mentioned are in music, classical music. So I was an instrumental music major in undergrad and a flute performance major in graduate school. And that did not prepare me to be a business executive, surprisingly. But of course, I learned a lot that there were a lot of takeaways, such as enormous discipline and practice and setting goals and setting very small goals, and then ultimately accumulating a lot of small goals, which ultimately then can be an ultimate goal. So all of those lessons, literal lessons that I took and gathered and learned have been a great platform for me. And when I was transitioning from music to business, I thought marketing was the perfect sort of bridge in that space because it was creative. And I didn't really know, I never took any marketing courses. So I had honestly, frankly, no idea what it was, but I had an instinct and a sense of it. And my path to get there was working for the March of Dimes in Colorado at the time, and for 3.5 years. And what I learned, advertising, PR, dealing with highly compensated professional volunteers, event planning, strategic planning, crisis management. I learned all of the tools that were ultimately necessary for me as a young professional to make this transition. And then very circuitously still, I got a securities license because I worked for a small oil and gas company where my boss was a crook, literally disappeared in the middle of the night, and left all kinds of investors along the side of the road. So there were opportunities for me to just gather an additional framework. And what it really taught me, all of that sort of on-the-job learning, was ultimately you make ethical and moral decisions every single step of your way as a as a professional, and there are all these opportunities, some obvious, some less obvious. And that's where I learned it all. That's where I sort of got my ethical, moral framework, was being confronted by a series of decisions that had to be made that day. And that was a very interesting foundation for ultimately now my 30 plus year career in law, where I started as the first director of marketing at a large law firm in the Southwest, to now 15 and a half years later being the founder and CEO of my own company that serves law firms, from the largest law firms in the world down to small, high-performing boutiques.
So it's a fascinating journey, obviously, and obviously you've learned a lot about grit and determination and force of will. So out of that, one could necessarily discern that you are not unlike many women who are strong and capable. You're a strong-willed person with a clear view on right and wrong. So that led to some self-examination at some point. And the only reason I say that is because of your recent TED-style talk, the sunny side of shame. And you and I talked about this before offline, but tell me how you thought about that, doing it, what gave rise to it, and how people have reacted to it, and what kind of surprised you about it.
Yes, I know exactly when I thought I was going to, it sort of came to me that it was time to give it. It was Christmas 2018. And I was invited to give a speech in San Francisco to a business audience, largely an audience of lawyers, men and women. And the speeches, it was a part of a series, and the speeches that were given by great friends of mine in the legal marketing industry were all business related speeches, and they were, about self-motivation and self-branding and these various things that are, I know all of them were excellent and all of them were well received. Having said that, the series kicked off in December, and by May, when my speech was scheduled, I determined that, as I'm looking now ahead at Christmas to May, thinking, well, nobody's going to want to hear any more of that. And what I'm an expert in and what I talk about a lot are law firm websites and foundational best practices for websites and business development strategies and how to win more business and things like that. And I thought, oh my gosh, nobody's going to want to hear that. And I just had this feeling that storytelling and telling my personal story as the foundation for ultimately having a really personal, authentic conversation with business professionals about what is really holding you back from your own feelings about success. I thought there was an opportunity there. And so I just, jumped in with both feet, and I wasn't sure what I was getting into. And the interesting, as sort of an aside, the interesting part is I had never told my family my story ever. So I had to tell my brother. My parents are deceased. I had to tell my brother, and we sat down at a really cool bar in the middle of the afternoon over the Christmas holiday in Minnesota, small town Minnesota, and I told my story, and we both cried, and he was loving and sweet, but that was the first family member I had ever told. So that was a big deal that I had to get that out of the way first. And once I received a warm embrace about that, I thought, well, that's really what I needed, because the whole crux of my story is that I grew up in a family of secret keepers, and we just didn't tell.
So if you can share and if you're comfortable, what's the secret? What happened?
Yeah, so the secret, and it's the first sentence in my TED style talk on YouTube, is that I was raped when I was 4 years old.
Oh my God.
And it was not a family member, thank goodness. It was the son of a babysitter who was probably 11 or 12 at the time. And I was staying at their house while my parents were away, and I stayed at their house regularly. And this one time, and I honestly don't remember if it happened more than once, but I know the first time it happened, or potentially only time it happened, but I remember it so vividly. But for years, I didn't remember it, and I think because it happened, and then I knew I couldn't go home and tell my parents because I knew they wouldn't understand. And again, I'm 4 years old, so I am now assessing my home life and determining it is not safe for me to go home and tell, because there was this, I don't know, preponderance of secret keeping that was, that nobody talked about it, but I just knew, and I felt it, and I just felt I would be blamed somehow. I would be ostracized, ridiculed, punished, certainly punished. I felt I would have been punished, probably for telling a lie. The reaction probably would have been that my father would have thought I was telling a lie.
So let's just hit the pause button there and figuratively and unpack what you just said. So you're a 4-year-old. You have a trusted relationship with friends of the family. You go into a situation where that trust is metaphorically and physically violated. And at 4, you conclude that by telling somebody, you're going to get in trouble and bad things are going to happen to you. So therefore, you need to keep the secret.
Exactly.
So that means that before 4, wittingly or unwittingly, the family culture was one that there are some things we talk about and there's some things we just don't talk about. And those lines are drawn in a way that only that family can discern.
Yes, I think that's right. And it's interesting, until this very moment, Todd, I'd never actually thought of, I've never really had a conversation about, okay, what happened before you were 4, before this incident. I do remember, it was sort of a corporal punishment family. My brother and I were, beaten as children by our dad, who, did it out of love. And it was because we were misbehaving, or we were, we had, both of us had vivid imaginations. And so I was a storyteller. I was very much a storyteller as a kid. And so I was making up stories, and that my dad kept saying it was a lie. All those things are lies. So I would be punished for telling lies. And so I think that's the environment. That's what ultimately I was confronted with, and thought, okay, well, I don't want that. I don't want to be punished.
So to understand that better, there's a range of corporal punishment. And I grew up in a time when that was very, very permitted. So I, enjoyed the wrath of my parents in a similar way. Although you used the term beaten as opposed to the term spanked or swatted or some other term, was it more aggressive than spanking, or?
When we were little, it was probably spanking, but when we were my last physical encounter with my dad was when I was in 10th grade, and that was an all-out beating. And my brother, I remember when I was little, my brother had done something that he felt was completely inappropriate when Greg was probably in 9th grade, and he was beaten. And so it was, there was bruising, and I remember in 10th grade, he had pulled my hair so hard, my hair was coming out in handfuls. So it was that, and I was afraid of him my entire life. And I think he had no sense of it. I think that's what parents do.
Well, it's strange credulity that you could characterize this as an act of love. But let me first and foremost say how sorry I am that you had to deal with that. No one should ever have to deal with that under any circumstances for any reason. And I'm just terribly sorry to hear that you had to endure that. Trying to circle back, and it's not easy hearing stories like that, but trying to circle back to your story, going back, you decided to film a TED Talk. You gave the message at the event. What happened? How was that received? And what was the message, that you could give in that environment?
The original speech in San Francisco was actually a much longer speech. In fact, it actually was closer to an hour, maybe 45 minutes or so. I had audio and video segments of that added some both color and shape to the story. But the people in the audience started crying. So and then we had cocktails afterwards. It was this reception. It was in a law firm environment, but people were very interested in staying around and talking. And so the guests stood around in this San Francisco environment, which was in person, for 2 hours, and we were all telling stories, and people wanted to tell their own stories. And similarly, when I gave this speech in April at a virtual conference, and it was much more of a TED style format, so I pared it down to essentially 20 minutes. I had so many friends and acquaintances, people I've known for a long time professionally, because this was a professional environment, not exclusively law firms, but professionals and people I've been, friends on Facebook, or certainly LinkedIn contacts and things like that over the years, reached out to me, and we scheduled a Zoom discussion, and they wanted to tell their stories. And so some people I've known very well, shared things that they've never told anyone else. And I believe what happened is that in me, they saw a strong woman, someone who's had a certain degree of success that they also had, and that they enjoyed, but they still had this story that they'd never shared with anybody.
So your act of courage, essentially, because it took an immense amount of courage, and that should not be understated at all, just an immense amount of courage to go up and talk about this, gave them permission, essentially, to share and say, hey, it's okay, it is possible. And one might argue it's more than possible, but it's possible to be both strong and vulnerable, and to have had that vulnerability compromised by trusted people, and talk about the horrors of that and the long-term implications of that. Was there any negative feedback you got?
No. And in today's world of quick run to judgment and moral indignation and all of these different feelings that people have so publicly today, I have not gotten any negative feedback at all, not one comment at all that, I mean, even on YouTube, no down thumbs. So it's like, yay for that. I think if I did receive that, I would take it as someone who just wasn't ready to own their own story. I think anyone because my entire message is that there is an opportunity to step out of the deep end of shame and see the light of day. And that's where the sunny side of shame comes in. But you have to own it, and you have to own all of the bad that you associate with it, and just find a way to move through it. And generally the way through it is just one step at a time.
So talk about that for a little bit. When you say you need to own the shame, that's a very, very big, enormous sentence with a lot of gravity, kind of the size of Jupiter. So tell me what you mean by own the shame.
Well, first there has to be a recognition that there is something that is holding you back. And what I see a lot, and have seen my entire career, particularly working with lawyers, high-performing people, really high-performing, high potential professionals, is that many of them are unhappy. Many of them aren't, which is great, but many are unhappy, and many are sort of hindered or aren't as successful as they think they should be. I have seen that a lot, where they look kind of longingly at the rainmaker in their firm and say, well, Todd is so great at that. Why can't I be like that? And they assume, well, Todd's an extrovert, I'm an introvert, that must be the reason. And so they put sort of labels on themselves, which may or may not be true. And ultimately they start limiting themselves. They start self-editing in a way that is a highly unproductive, and ultimately is a complete, sabotages their potential for success. And they don't even know they're doing it, because I call it a false self. By anyone's standards, I was successful, but I felt like I wasn't deserving of the success, or I felt like, not because I didn't work hard, because I completely did work hard, but it was that underlying feeling of, I'm just not quite good enough to have this level of success. I'm not. And
link that back to shame and the events when you were 4. How does that correlate? Why does that make you not worthy?
I think because there was this underlying, I don't know what the word is, this underlying belief that, certainly for years I had that belief. And then I logically no longer had it, but I think emotionally I still had it. That feeling of being dirty, or feeling like I was imperfect, and surely there must be something wrong with me if somebody did that to me.
In other words, maybe you weren't deserving of safety, you weren't deserving of respect, you weren't deserving of your own personal space and your boundaries, and you also weren't deserving of the right to tell the story that you had been violated to even your parents. Is that kind of all part of this, the makeup?
I think it is. And I think as it relates to boundaries, the concept of boundaries is a very interesting one, because I felt like I had none. I had no boundaries. And I think that is not an uncommon feeling. That people grow up, people with any kind of a shame story, or who grow up feeling like a misfit or feeling other, the boundary system that seems so clear to some people and families, I just didn't have that. And they were, so consequently, I would always found myself, even professionally, found myself in settings where there was someone or sort of an organizational morality that was coming closer than it should, was making advances in some way, or trying to exert influence or power over, or something like that. And I just didn't have a sense that I had any permission at all to challenge it. So I found myself kind of dancing around it, to just keep myself standing and keep myself, doing my job and keeping relationships going and everything else. I just found, and again, that false self was very, amoebic in kind of a way, because it kept morphing from one, okay, I had to be this person here, but then I had to be this person over here. And so it wasn't just one false self I was trying to keep track of. There were more than one, depending on what the boundary structure or lack of boundary structure was.
So you almost had to be a psychological and emotional chameleon, changing your colors depending upon the environment in which you were then existing. So I'm sort of borrowing on a metaphor there for you, but this has two implications. Let me just see if I can recap, because I think this is really important. And I don't know, I want to make sure I get it right. It sounds to me like the first thing you had to do is acknowledge this thing happened to you. Acknowledge and give yourself permission to say, hey, this wasn't my fault. I had a right to safety. I was violated, and that person didn't have the right to do what they did. I had the right to tell family members. And I guess the other side of the coin is, I made an election. It may have been supported by a whole bunch of good reasons that you made the election, but I made the election to keep it a secret. So, and then once you get that through that, then you can figure out how to undo some of the implications and the manifestations of that psychology that have manifested in your own psychology many years later. That leads to two things. One is a question around, how did you do that professionally? Meaning, did you find resources that could help you through that very, very challenging walk? And then secondly, how did that show up in your professional life? So start with the resources you had to figure out how to obtain, and were they helpful, and how did you go from there?
There were no conventional resources in terms of, even the mentor, sort of professional mentor mentee. I grew up without that. So in my career, I never had a traditional mentor, but I did seek therapy. I had two bad experiences with psychiatrists in Colorado. That one that it was under the auspices of marital therapy with a former husband, and neither was a good experience at all, because they were both friends of my husband's, or they were very supportive of his point of view. So it was not an equal playing field at all. Fortunately, I wasn't dissuaded from the idea of getting therapeutic treatment. And when I moved to Dallas, after a year or so, I was in a very, very bad relationship I couldn't seem to get out of. And I thought, okay, that's a perfect catalyst. So I went and I saw the therapist, and it was kind of funny. He was a referral from a friend. His name was Jim. And my first session walking into gym, again, I'm very professional and I'm very composed. And I walked in and I said, okay, there are 3 things I want to deal with. I'm in this relationship I can't seem to get out of. I'm tired of the sexual abuse, being an issue. I finally want to be done with it. And I want to focus on my relationship with my dad. And he started laughing out loud. And I thought, well, you asshole, what? And he didn't do it he almost did it in a way that suggested, he was laughing at me and my composure and my, okay, let's just get this done kind of thing. And so he then said, I can help you get out of the relationship. The sexual abuse will never be over, but I can help you intervene. And tell me about your relationship with your mother. And it was like, what? So I then said, okay, this is the guy. And he was the guy. And I saw him for almost 10 years. So I was really committed. And it took that long. And, I think people with therapy, anyone who's been through therapy says, yeah, therapy was great. I went for 6 months and it's sort of, okay, we're done with that.
So the message there to those listening in the audience is you think you have the problem diagnosed correctly, and then all of a sudden something happens where another perspective comes in and you say, whoops, got that all wrong.
Yeah.
Or I got it partially wrong. But I guess the other message here to listeners is, like many professionals and professional offerings, it's hard to find the one who actually can help you. Ironically, I've had this challenge immensely in finding lawyers who are capable, as I've talked to you before. It's just astonishing. But it exists in every profession. But I think the other message is you can't give up. You got to keep trying. And fortunately, you had the resources to do that because you had you were obviously successful, but you had the financial wherewithal to go to it as well. There was another piece of this that was the second question around sexual harassment. And my sense is that you were dealing with a lot of that at the office. And there's something to me that's coming out around how your journey, and I'm going to use a word that's popularized right now, but your journey led to a different form of conviction and authenticity in yourself that gave you new sources of strength to address from a different perspective the issue of sexual harassment. Now, I could have gotten all that wrong, but let me just put that out there as a hypothesis. Am I on target there or not?
I don't know. I don't know if you are. I don't know if you're not. I don't know that authenticity is. I think authenticity is definitely a 21st century word, even though it certainly has been around for millennia, probably. But I think that the rise of social media and people feeling comfortable sharing their stories, or again, sort of the personal branding that people are wanting to do to elevate themselves, I think they believe fundamentally that they are being authentic.
Well, and the idea is that you can say, look, this is who I am, and you're going to deal with me as I am. And I'm going to be true to who I am, and you have to be true to who you can elect to be true to who you are or not, but you're going to be true in your dealings with me as I am.
I think that's right, and I think what a lot of a lot of what we see today is a desire for visibility, and as opposed to healing. And I would say that my goal all along was just to feel quote unquote normal and feel not like a misfit. And so it comes from such a different place. I was never looking for visibility around it. In fact, which is largely why I didn't tell the story for all those years. And when the Me Too movement started really catching steam, 2018, the Harvey Weinstein, I mean, I'd been putting up with that my entire career in some of the most colossal ways, just outrageous breaches of the professional environment that I starting at the March of Dimes and, throughout pretty much throughout every organization. And I was never going to say anything about it. I needed my jobs. I was not going to let it get in my way. And I honestly think, even though it was annoying and maddening and disappointing, I did not have the same level of outrage that we see today about it. And I still don't. And I don't know, that could be some, I don't know, twisted something that is just wrong with me, that I don't have that same level of outrage. But I think that and I certainly don't rack it up to the boys will be boys either. I absolutely don't. I just think that there are so many things that go on in our lifetimes that and certainly in a professional environment that we are confronted with and that we have to deal with and we have to encounter and just move through. And if you make everything you encounter that's uncomfortable a problem for you, then it's hard to make progress. So I may get lots and lots of backlash about that, but I just feel that every person is going to deal with these things differently. Every woman will handle a sexual harassment encounter differently. And to suggest that there's only one way of getting through it is, I think, unfair to others who've gone through the same thing.
So I think the idea is certainly, well, I don't want to say certainly, I will say for the record that sexual harassment should not be tolerated. I think every person, and given that this happens more often than not to women, then I would say every woman has to make a decision on how she handles not tolerating it. But I think there's a question around how do you get past this? And I want to, if I may, ask you about a particular story that you shared with me. And I was just aghast. But this to me is an example of the story that some of the stories you're alluding to, but haven't quite come out and said. And if you can, please share the story about your role as a marketing director in putting together this annual trip and the outcome after you put that on and what happened. And to me, it's just unbelievable.
That was an unbelievable story. And I just by way of clarification, my comments about sexual harassment really relates to sexual inappropriate, not like harassment in this kind of story I'm going to tell, which I absolutely immediately went to the managing partner in the firm and told him. So I was the marketing director at a large law firm, and one of my responsibilities, my department's very small department's responsibilities, was putting on an annual dove hunt. And since we just passed Labor Day in Texas, that is the opening weekend of dove season. And I was in Snyder, Texas, and getting ready for this event, getting ready for people to arrive. And a carload of partners at the time had been playing golf all day, arrived at the venue completely drunk, and at about 4 o'clock, and the first hunt was going to be at 5 o'clock. And
So these are partners in the law firm. These are the big dogs who
partners.
are the rainmakers, theoretically, the
Yeah.
equity holders of the firm. So theoretically, the most responsible leaders of the firm show up, blistered drunk, driving a car.
Yes.
So you don't even pass go on this one.
Right. And they're carrying guns. So
that's always a wise idea. It's good to combine inebriation with loaded weapons. That's always smart.
Yes, yes. So I suggested to them in the nicest, Susie tour guide kind of way that, perhaps they could sit this one out and just let everybody else. We had about 85 clients, mostly clients, and a few other lawyers from the law firm participating.
So you're a musician. We'll call these, you try to persuade them with dulcet tones.
With my most dulcet tones, yes. And they, of course, had none of it. So I called the administrative partner in the firm, and I told him, there's nothing you can do here. I'm just letting you know. I know we have insurance, but I'm just letting you know. I had this conversation with them. I'm concerned about this. We have 75 clients here and drunk partners with guns. And I'm just alerting you in advance. I pray that nothing happens. And the prayers worked because nothing happened. But fast forward to now, Tuesday after Labor Day, back in the office. And I find that the administrative partner called in those partners and read them the riot act and said, Deborah told me that. So he completely threw me under the bus, probably unwittingly so, but I was under that bus nonetheless. And what ultimately happened is then anytime I would see any of those lawyers in the hallway, from the youngest associate to the senior most partner, they would call me the C word under their breath as I'm walking by them. And that went on for probably a week. And there were probably 10 or 15 of those lawyers. So that was a lot of day after day after day in the hallway, kind of, that I just ignored it. But then one of the sort of ringleaders of this, of the drunk gang, came into my office screaming expletives, and he was so angry at me, and he was just screaming at me, and he took this giant, typical law firm club chair that was on the other side of my desk and put it over his head. And it was so clear to me in that moment that he was going to throw it at me. And my office was my desk was in such a place, there was no way he could have misfired, because my desk chair was actually at the point of where the wall came together. And so I just scooted around and ran out the door, and he pivoted with this chair over his head and threw it after me as I am running out the door. And he completely broke the door frame in my office.
Which was glass?
No, it was wood, and probably mostly wood.
Okay.
But it broke the door frame.
And what happened to him?
Nothing. Well, he certainly never had to apologize to me. I went to the managing partner and the administrative partner, and they apologized profusely. They were horrified, but he wasn't fired, and he never was forced to apologize to me.
So implicit in this idea is here on the one hand, you have these law firms who are your clients who are trying to put out messages around marketing messages around who they are, what they want to do, how they're inclusive, et cetera. And they're putting that on their websites that you're designing. And you're saying, hey, wait a minute, guys, you're still failing, and here's why. And so if you really want to be successful, this is what you do. So what did you tell them?
So, and that's exactly the work I do. It is to dig deep and not use all of the language that every other law firm uses. And there is this default language that they've grown up with and that all the law firms use, and they all want to be trusted advisors, and they all focus on their client service and responsiveness, and we're very client-centered, and we're very client-focused, and all those things. And it's just blah, blah, blah noise to the buyer of legal services who's heard it all a million times before. And the buyers are looking for honesty. And I don't mean honesty in terms of I'm going to tell you the truth. They're looking for that emotional honesty that can cause them to feel so comfortable. And as a buyer of legal services, they want an intimate relationship with their lawyer. They want it to be filled with truth telling and with trust in the place where the advice is coming from. That it is so sort of perfect in its
Well, I'd be happy with good advice and with professional competence. I'd stop there. But beyond
and you think that's table stakes, right? That's just table stakes.
One would
think. So I'm so sorry.
It's been a lot harder to find than you'd imagine. But the issue then kind of correlates back to how do you really show up, especially as the workforce becomes more diverse, both internally and with regard to your clients. Boards of directors are more diverse. But if they're behaving like this on a regular basis, as they have with you, in your experience and your stories, how on earth can they possibly ever retain good talent? Because as we know, the law schools are now populated with half or more than half are women. Then how on earth is it possible for them to retain to hire and retain good talent, or to retain client relationships with behind the scenes? Their conduct is so unimaginably brazen and horrific.
Well, I believe, and I haven't been inside as an employee in a law firm since 1998, and I do believe that the last 20 years there's been an enormous progress. I also think there have been tragic stories. There's one story in particular, and I'll answer your question, but one story in particular where a partner in a major global law firm in one of their United Kingdom offices was accused of sexual harassment at a holiday party. And this was, I think, 2018, 2019 timeframe. So the Me Too movement had come out. And so there was more acceptance about having those conversations, and law firms were taking those conversations. Now, if they weren't before, many of them certainly were before, but if they weren't before, we're definitely taking them seriously today. And women felt empowered to be able to actually say, okay, this guy was inappropriate at this holiday party, and he jumped off a cliff in Wales and killed himself.
Oh my gosh.
The management of the firm talked to him, and he killed him, and he literally jumped off a cliff and killed himself. And so so there's this confluence for now. Think of law firm leaders and how do you manage the law firm? You now have very, very, very open conversations about mental health, there are countless articles in the American Lawyer and National Law Journal and these other publications, and certainly in the business media about the mental health crisis among, again, it's not exclusive to lawyers, certainly high performing, high potential professionals. And then, so the delicacy around that, and then you've got the delicacy around, yeah, but this guy was inappropriate to me, and them managing those conversations. So my heart goes out to the management of that law firm because it was awful. I mean, both stories were awful, and so what law firm leaders today in assessing talent, what we are seeing is this enormous contribution, enormous investment in financial and certainly in terms of other resources in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the intentions are all great, I think, by and large. What's happening is that the only way for them to feel like they're making progress is by measuring numbers. Okay, they count faces, female faces, male faces, LGBTQ faces, people of color, people with disabilities, all those diverse faces, and they count them and they say, well, our numbers this year are better than last year. So what are you doing? But you're highlighting the differences, and all of those, and women, and all the women lawyers, I just had this conversation with a client of mine. They don't want to be viewed as women lawyers. They just want to be viewed as lawyers. And so the DEI investments coming from the top down, and that's a very big message. Our commitment is from the top down. Well, I think it has to be from the bottom up, where the storytelling can happen. And a woman who felt other, I mean, by anyone's standards, I don't look, other than the fact that I was a woman in business and in a largely white male dominated business 35 years ago. So that made me diverse back then, but by today I'm not diverse in the least. But I still felt other or like a misfit my entire life. Very similarly to these people that we're now counting, and the stories, their origin stories, where they came from, what has hurt them in their lifetimes. Those are the stories that to feel heard and to feel a part of an organization. I believe those are the stories that have to be told. And that's where the acceptance, they will feel accepted if they feel they are accepted for who they really are, as opposed to being a number, a minority face, and I think and that they are invited in not because they are a diverse person, but the inclusion is around, I get you. I get who you are now. Thank you for sharing that story.
So we started our conversation today learning a little bit about your story, and then that kind of evolved into a discussion around how your story helped you understand and address things both personally and professionally. And then we've observed how professionally we still, throughout all of industry, have a long way to go to get to the right place. I'm wondering, how do we change the dynamic? How do we change the discussion from one where individual groups of people, any of the number you just went through, you rattled off, is changed from discussing that and quotas, if you will, to a different topic around how do we bound together? How do we come together and fight the commonly shared view that these things are bad and that we need to unify our work in addressing the elimination of the bad things that we're discussing, whether it's sexual harassment, whether it's exclusion for one reason or another, whether it's any of a number of other issues. How do we change the dialogue into one where we collectively are unified to fight against that problem? And things like quotas and head counts and other metrics like that are going to be wildly unsatisfying as a tool to address the commonly shared view of elimination of these societal ills.
Boy, if I could answer that quickly, I could, I'd be a multi-millionaire. I think it's hard. And I think I had an interesting conversation with the former chair of an AmLaw 100 firm recently, and which is one of the largest firms in the American Lawyer 100, AmLaw 100. And we were talking about this, and he said they're so focused on money. The big firms, smaller firms too, are so focused on profitability and making the money that they make year after year, and doing what you just suggested, or even what I suggested, which is find ways to develop a culture of storytelling and promoting that kind of authenticity and acceptance is going to be time consuming. And
well, let me offer you a different thought. I'm going to do something, hopefully you'll consider a pleasant surprise. I'm going to suggest that your background, it uniquely qualifies you to help. And it's not because of the unfortunate experiences you've had to deal with, but it's because of your music background. If you think about it, an orchestra works best when it's all working together. It is comprised of players of a bunch of different instruments. They all look and sound different, and yet they all play a role in contributing to an outcome called a composition or a song. And if there's any abrasion, if there's any fault, if there's any miscue or failed performance in that orchestra, the orchestra kind of screeches a little bit. Oftentimes the conductor throws a fit, but generally the orchestra screeches a little bit. So isn't the analogy we're looking for that we want to have the firm operate like an orchestra, with everybody given the opportunity to find their chair, to play their flute or their instrument, as the case may be, and to execute as flawlessly as possible, given the sheet music before them?
That is really interesting. And I think it's a really good analogy. And what strikes me is that to be a fine member of the orchestra, you have to take enormous responsibility to be an extraordinary performer on your own. And so there's a tremendous amount of personal responsibility and accountability that you have every single day on your own to then bring to the orchestra. So at least, if there's screeching, by golly, it's not going to be my screeching. And what's interesting in that environment, even the rehearsal environment, which I've probably certainly over 1,000 hours of rehearsal time in my, sort of real rehearsal time in my career. It's okay. If Todd is the trombone player and has a solo and you're not getting it, he's going to call you out in front of the entire 100-piece orchestra. And he's going to say, Todd, you've got to, this, you're missing this, you're missing this. And there's loads of nuance typically to the kind of comments that are made and the expectations. And all of us know, we all expect Todd's going to get it. Because if Todd doesn't get it, we're all going to be a little bit mad at Todd. and that is the culture, and it's the expectation. And that's why we continue to have music programs and band directors and orchestra directors in schools, public schools and private schools and in colleges, and kids still go on and get these degrees just like I did, because it's so clear what the accountability standards are and expectations are. And I think and the goal is absolutely a shared goal. So in a law firm, for example, could we take a big law firm and really truly have a shared goal, have the share of the firm willing to be in sort of the orchestra environment, the way that Herbert von Karajan or something would lead the Berlin Philharmonic. Is there that kind of a person who would actually be willing to lead that way? And frankly, and do they have a culture where they could actually call out Todd and say, Todd, this is not working, or this is your behavior in this way is not conducive with what we want here. And if you don't ultimately get it right, we're going to have to find someone else. Yeah. I think that would be extraordinary.
Well, my view of this is it's all a system, and we need to look at this as a system and employ systems thinking to it all around a whole range of things. But Deborah, I could talk to you for another 2 or 3 hours, and I'm sure you don't have the time for me to do that. So thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you so much for sharing your story. Again, I'm grateful for your courage and your bravery to talk about this. And I'm also grateful for the impact you're having, personally and professionally on your friends, but also on the entirety of the industry. Thank you so much for being with me today.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Todd.
Thanks for watching this week's episode of Civil Discourse. To learn more about today's topic or our guest, visit www.the60percentsolution.com or www.tfip.group.